Welcome to episode 254, Empowering Neurodivergence, Honoring Neurological Differences from Giftedness to ADHD, featuring Dr. Matt Zakreski, licensed clinical psychologist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and the topic today is very close to my heart for a number of reasons. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Matt Zakreski. He is a clinical psychologist, and one of his specializations is working with and supporting neurodivergent clients. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Matt.
Oh, I am thrilled to be here. I was listening to some episodes as I did my prep, and I'm like, I'm going to like this conversation. I'm excited.
Well, I'm excited to have you. Neurodivergence, neurodiversity, these are terms that are relatively new-ish on the scene. Before we get to breaking down the terms, I would love for you to tell our listeners, how did you start focusing on this particular topic? And then we'll dive into it.
Well, you know, like we say in our field, all research is me search, right? So, you know, in second grade, I got identified as gifted and, you know, got to do the whole gifted song and dance. Like, you know, like there was a trailer in the back of the schoolyard that once a month they took us there and we played Legos. And no one ever explained to us why we were playing Legos. It's like, oh, the smart kids get to play with the Legos. And then I hit something called the performance cliff in 8th grade. That's when, to make a long story short, it's when school becomes harder than you are smart, which for neurotypical people happens much earlier, so they have to develop study skills. But gifted kids don't learn that stuff because they don't need it. So you're cruising along, and all of a sudden you fall off a cliff somewhere between 7th and 10th grade, because while you've been cruising around on like raw intelligence, everyone else has been developing structures and systems that support learning. So it's like, oh, wait, if I can't just work harder, I need to actually how to do this stuff. So crashed on that, went to Gifted Kids Summer Camp, repaired my soul, learned how to study, went to college, but banged around for a little bit because I was like, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And then ended up in grad school. And my first place was at a school for neurodivergent learners. And I was like, this is what I want to do with my life. These are my people. And you know, and now I get to travel the country, travel the world, giving talks on how to support people with different brains in a world that's not built for them. And, you know, I have to pinch myself most mornings because I can't believe that I get to do what I love and work that feels really meaningful to me, because it all starts with, I want to help the kids who are like me.
Awesome. I'm super excited for this conversation. And like already my mouth is hanging open. I'm like, that's what that's called? Because I'm like, that sounds like 10th grade for me.
Yep, there's a word for it.
Yeah. To self-disclose here, I was one of those gifted kids, highly sensitive, diagnosed with ADHD, definitely all different shades of neurodivergent. So this, like I said, is very near and dear to me. For people who are listening who are not familiar with that term of neurodivergence, can you kind of break that?
So if we take all the brains in the world are neurodiversity. So it's like the diversity of nature, the diversity of people, right? It's just all the things. 80% of people are neurotypical. Their brains work basically as we'd expect a brain to work. There's some variation, but it's kind of analogous to the first standard deviation on the normal curve. About 80% of people, their brains just do more or less what they're supposed to, which means 20% of people, their brains work differently in some way. And that can be both in form and in function. So, you know, for instance, one of my fun other neurodivergences, I'm colorblind. So my rods and cones don't send the right information to my occipital lobe in the back of my brain, which means I can't tell tonal differences of color apart. So much fun for me. It isn't. It's not fun at all. I hate it. But so that's a function piece. But, you know, to use giftedness as an example, in the corpus callosum, gifted people have somewhere between 3 to 5 times more neurons than a neurotypical person. So a neurotypical person has between 70 and 100 million neurons. In gifted people, it's between 3 and 400 million. So, when Einstein died and they looked at his brain, they were like, it's not bigger. We thought it would be bigger because he's so smart, right? The whole egghead thing, it's not bigger, it's richer, it's deeper, it's more interconnected, right? It's like a really good soup. Like, you got to let it cook for a long time. And that's the sort of thing. Like, our brains have so much more going on internally. So, of this 20% of the populace that are neurodivergent, sort of the big five that I run into are giftedness, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and OCD. These are all things that we can point at brain scans and say, this is how your brain is working differently, which allows us to ground the conversations we have about how to serve you from a place of science, not a place of you're a person and you're screwing up.
So when you're thinking about neurodivergence, for people who have heard this term but might not exactly know what it is, can you expand on what diagnoses we typically see is considered neurodivergent? And then also I guess really what neurodivergent isn't, because one of the things that I'd heard people say recently is everybody's neurodivergent these days.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that?
Right. I was on a podcast a couple of years ago where the host asked me, do you think this is the most neurodivergent generation? And I'm like, no, this is the most openly neurodivergent generation. Ask anybody in your family, ask any family, and you'll find the quirky uncle or your grandfather who only collected red wire, right? My, my great uncle, and I never met the man, but I'll take this as because it's family lore. He had to have his shoes ordered in length order, because they were all the same size, right? He was a size 12 shoe, but how long the shoes were mattered, and he could not settle until his shoes were organized in length. And I just think to myself, well, golly gee, that's not a brain that does what normal brains do. That's a very different brain. And, I think the research is really starting to catch up on this, that we're getting to a point where we're not going to call things like ADHD, autism, giftedness, dyslexia, mental illnesses anymore. I think what we're seeing now is that these are different operating systems. And because the operating system, it's like you're trying to run a Mac OS on an IBM. They're all computers, but there's a friction that occurs when you're running a system that isn't built for the system it's in. So that's why you see people who are neurodivergent who have much higher rates of anxiety and depression, adjustment disorders, right? Post-traumatic stress. These are all things that we see because you're trying to navigate a world that's just not built for you. And, it's funny because there's also a sizable overlap between left-handed people and gifted people. Do you know left-handed people are significantly more likely to die by suicide? Yeah, because, what some of the research shows is that it's a million little indignities. So often journals are not poetic, but that's a million little indignities. You walk into a room and you have to find a left-handed desk. You can't drive a stick shift because in America, stick shifts are on the right-hand side. Are you going to reach over your body? That's weird. Left-handed scissors are never as good as right-handed scissors. Notebooks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of my female friends is left-handed, and she's like, do you know that bras are not built for left-handed people? They're built for right-handed people. Having never worn one myself, it never occurred to me, but holy crap, right? So a million little indignities, and it creates a higher stress and a lower threshold of joy, et cetera, et cetera. So, what we're seeing, right, is that when neurodivergent people are in affirming environments, they soar. They do amazing work. But when you have to spend most of your time convincing people that you exist and then convincing people to help you based on the fact that you exist, you're just taking up so much bandwidth, right?
It has been my lived experience. I didn't connect the piece about neurodivergence until well into adulthood. I just knew that I always felt different, and that sometimes that worked in my favor, and a lot of times also didn't. When it came to engaging, particularly in an academic environment. And I'm just going to call a spade here for our listeners. I have a puppy behind me who has discovered a squeaky toy, and we're just going to let it be what it is. You mentioned that there could be an increase in other mental health conditions like anxiety. Can you expand on that? And knowing that there's a ton to say here, and that's like a loaded question, but to boil it down, like what do we really see in this population when it comes to comorbidity?
So we're going to stay in the biology, and then we'll expand that into what we do for a living, right? So, our bodies have two systems, right? Sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system fires when we feel like we're in danger, when we're in threat, and it gives us that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. So the more neurodivergent you are, the more sensitive your system is. And since almost every type of neurodivergence comes with weaker prefrontal cortex function, so weaker executive functioning skills, you have a hair trigger system that doesn't have good brakes. So I always tell my clients, it's like you're driving a 2026 Ferrari Testarossa with the brakes in the big wheel that you drove when you were 3. It's just a terrible combination of things. So what happens is our systems trigger far more often than a neurotypical person's would. My colleague Josh Shane always says that a gifted person will have their feelings catastrophically hurt when most people wouldn't even have feelings. And it's not to overuse a jargony word, but it's almost like we're gaslit by the world because we feel so much and we feel it so deeply that people are like, why do you care about that? Like, I guess, yeah, it's sad that Australia is on fire, but like, I read that news article and moved on with my life, and you're sitting in a corner sobbing and you've never been to Australia. And it's hard to connect the depth of that emotionality to people who, it's not even that they don't want to get it, it's just that they don't understand it, right? One of my colleagues, she works a lot with the Latino gifted population, and she's like, the best analogy I can come up with it is that I grew up in a bilingual household. I think in Spanish, I dream in Spanish, I can speak Spanish when I'm not even thinking, versus someone who clearly went to school to learn Spanish. She's like, we're speaking the same language, but there's a depth and there's a musicality to it. There's just a richness that, it's really hard to achieve if it's not something you're really immersed in. And I think that people with brains like ours, we just feel a much richer emotional state. And unfortunately, that comes with a cost, right? Because our brains are much better at feeling the uncomfortable, sticky, icky emotions than they are feeling the happy, good, keep going emotions.
I really liked the analogy that you used about the operating system, because it really is a difference in the way that information is processed and stored and then used. When you talk about giftedness, again, one of those terms that some people may not be familiar with, like many of us are like familiar with the DSM diagnostic criteria for autism, but may not be familiar with this idea of giftedness. Can you expand on what giftedness is for people who may not know what it is?
So giftedness is an IQ measure that starts at 130, with two standard deviations away from the mean of 100. Now, what does that mean? Because those are a bunch of jargony terms. What it means is that if we consider the average person to have an IQ of 100, you are 2 full standard deviations away from that person. You are significantly different in a very major way. And giftedness comes with lots of brain differences, more neurons, faster neurons. The part of your brain that does creativity is much larger. Your parietal lobe, which does sensory integration in our body, is much more interconnected. Our limbic systems are significantly more wired. We have larger amygdala, which is sort of fight or flight emotions. So it's like gifted is so much more than just smart, right? It's a richness of being. It's a deeper way of feeling. It's significantly more sensitive to all the things. And I use this to push back on sort of the common parlance that like gifted people have it easy. That gifted, you want your kid to be in the gifted program because you think your kid is better. And it's like, it's not better. It's just different, right? It's a question of equity. And, the the example I use a lot is I have a good friend from college who's 6'9". And, when you're in a friend group in college, you end up being in a lot of people's weddings. And every time we're in a wedding together, he has to get his pants from a special place because Men's Warehouse does not do pants for 6'9" dudes. They just don't. Well, it's a terrible business model for them, right? So the world is not built for him. He's got to special order his pants, and he's great at reaching the thing on the top shelf because he's very, very tall. But he also is terrible at tying his shoes because it's like 1.5 miles down for him. So, right, he doesn't walk around saying he's better than anybody else. In fact, as he fondly says, he's like, I suck at basketball. He's like, I'm the worst basketball player in the world. I'm not very coordinated. But people always assume I'm good at sports because I'm very tall. So, like, it's really, to me, it's like gifted as a neurodivergence is your brain has a deep well of horsepower. It's a thing that it's a high potential to get to some places that other people may not be able to get to, or you can get to those places faster. And when we accommodate that kind of learning style, then kids can really like engage deeply, learn more, connect more things to more things, and contribute to not only a better classroom discourse, but a better output in terms of like the things I learned I am using to turn into goodness for the world.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm glad that you're breaking that down a little bit, because I think when we talk about these things, particularly terms like gifted sound loaded. And I'm glad you mentioned that, where it's kind of like, oh, then your kid is better than, or you think you're better than me, or whatever it is. And it is just a different operating system. And also, it's been my experience in working so much with neurodivergent folk that the SNAP, the strengths, needs, abilities, and preferences for neurodivergent clients, like sometimes there's a mismatch between the expectation that they're being met with and what's actually possible. And I'd love for you to talk about that. And we have so much to talk about in our conversation today, but like that idea about burnout, because you can have somebody who's highly gifted and have ADHD and cannot turn in a paper if their life depended on it, even though they probably already written it in their mind 6 times and could recite it in their sleep back to you. Can you speak about some of this? Because these are like the layers of what it means to be neurodivergent.
Yeah. And so one of the terms we use, sort of the term of art in the field, is twice exceptional. So when you are twice exceptional, you are gifted and a second kind of neurodivergence, usually ADHD or autism or dyslexia. So some sort of other brain difference that manifests in a different kind of learning. So what does that mean for us? It means that for somebody like me, I was so smart as a kid, nobody noticed I had ADHD, right? And you sort of sail through school and you keep forgetting there's tests, but because you're really smart, you get 94s on them and nobody is the wiser. And then you hit that performance lift we talked about before and the wheels come off and you're like, ah! So, one neurodivergence predicts other neurodivergence at a much higher rate. So when people come to my practice, I'm always like, okay, so where are we starting our neurodivergent journey? Well, I'm pretty sure I'm ADHD. Great, let's start there. We also should look at autism and Tourette's and giftedness and dyslexia. We want to get a full picture of your neurodivergence, because if we're only looking at one part of it, we may be missing other areas to intervene. And sometimes with other neurodivergences, they can be so loud that they overshadow giftedness. So, like let's say that you're dyslexic. We live in a very literary-based verbal society. If you struggle to read, a lot of people are going to discount you. Or let's say you have a stutter, right? Those are neurodivergences. So people are going to be like, oh, well, you're just not that smart. But if we give you a nonverbal intelligence test and you score in the 160s, it's like, oh, wait, damn. Okay, hold on a second. There's a lot going on, but we need to have the discipline and the sort of the ethos almost to look as deeply as we can in as many people as we can, because that's how we're going to get the best sense of everybody. And this gets to your question before, like, aren't we all a little neurodivergent? I say this all the time. Everybody has gifts. Like, I'm an above average cook. Like, if you came to my house, I'd cook you a pretty good meal. You'd be like, oh, this is an above average cook. Good job, Matt. I'm not a gifted chef. I would not beat Bobby Flay. You could not put me on Chopped. Do not put me on Chopped. I would not do well, right? So I have gifts. That doesn't mean I'm gifted, right? And I think that it's really important to really lay out those differences. So I don't want to gatekeep anybody, but I want to make sure that people are getting the right services and support for how their brain is showing up in the world. So when those neurodivergences combine, what you're going to get is a kid with really high highs and really, really low lows. And sometimes that gets you into the third kind of neurodivergence, which is what we like to call in the field the gifted C. So imagine you're sitting in college and you get A's on all your tests and papers, but you don't make it to class a lot. And when you're there, you don't really pay attention because you can't focus, and you don't ever remember to turn in the homework. So if you get zeros on class participation, attendance, and homework, but A's on the tests and papers, what do you think grade do you think what grade do you think that averages out to be?
See, and ask me how I know.
Yes, tell me, how do you know? Does it feel like I went through your history and just like a time travel movie and just kept popping up to take notes on what you were doing in 2007?
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, and it's one of the reasons that I love what I get to do. But just for me as a human being, I remember the first time that somebody said to me, you're highly sensitive, aren't you? And I was like, no.
You're highly sensitive. Shut up.
You. Right. Don't say that. And then, had to deconstruct, oh, there's that society that said it's a bad thing. And all the conditioning as a kid that's you're dramatic and you're too emotional and you feel too deeply. And so there was the giftedness of intellect, if you will, but then there was all the other stuff that came with it, and the sense of overwhelm and needing to, I'm one of those extroverted folk, but also has a deep need for introversion. And so how do I balance that? But so it's been decades of me kind of learning about myself, but I love the conversations with some of our past guests talking about, people assigned female at birth and the tendency toward really high masking autism, and how do we recognize and help a client with that? And, talking with Dr. Shiro Torquato about, if you don't have ADHD and it's not autism, and kind of the space in between of sensory processing sensitivity, and going oh, that really resonates. And also I have to imagine for so many of our listeners, because generally therapists are pretty deep feelers. A lot of us got into the field because we're deep feelers, or we felt separate from, and we want to bring other people in. And so I think there's a lot of this oh no, for folks when we have this conversation.
I mean, the otherness of being neurodivergent is so real, and I think it's such a multi-directional way of helping people, because obviously you understand yourself better. I always say knowledge is empowerment, right? The more you know about yourself, the more you can put yourself in better positions. It also helps the people who love us help us, right? Because psychology jargon alert. The fundamental attribution error. Yes. Right. So for those of you who are not nerds, well, you're listening to this podcast, you're clearly a nerd, right? But if you're not nerdy in the way we are.
Valid. Yeah.
Fundamental attribution error says that our brains take shortcuts. And when we don't know why a person is doing something, we tend to think it's a personal choice, right? If you saw me in a classroom and everyone else is taking notes and I'm looking out the window, you would think Matt doesn't care. Matt's a scatterbrain. Matt's a space cadet. Those are all words I heard about myself in high school. But then if you realize that those things flow from a place of neurodivergence, then you're putting context around that behavior, and context leads to compassion, and compassion leads to better service, right? So that's what we're really talking about here, right? And we know, you mentioned people assigned female at birth, like there's a super high level of LGBTQ plus identities in the neurodivergent space. And we talked about twice exceptional. This is thrice exceptional, or 3E. And a lot of the kiddos I work with are various types of LGBTQ plus. And it's the sort of thing, like, to really honor somebody's journey, we need to understand as much of it as we possibly can, including, do you feel like yourself in your body? And who do you love? And how do you love them? And I would go so far as to say that conversations that don't include these areas of connection are fundamentally missing something that our clients need.
I appreciate, as a queer neurodivergent person, the depth that you're bringing to the conversation, but also I think the challenge for us as clinicians to kind of hold all of these pieces in mind. One of my experiences as a clinician, I have had the honor of working with young adults, some of whom who have slipped through the cracks academically. They are the textbook twice exceptional, thrice exceptional kiddo who scores well on tests and then barely makes it through high school and gets so much messaging from potentially parents, coaches, teachers, principals, community, whatever it is, like really unpleasant labels about who you are. You are just lazy. You just don't care enough. It's been my experience working with neurodivergent folk and even unpacking it for myself that when I've been the one to be like, I'm noticing some things in the way that you speak and the way that you carry yourself and the things that you're interested in. Have you ever considered that you might be neurodivergent? Let's talk about autism and ADHD. Let's talk about Tourette's. Let's talk about these things. And, had sometimes the opportunity to work with a testing psychologist and then talk to testing psychologists, and they go, gosh, how did this person not end up in my office or someone's office like mine until they were 24? Like, how did this even? And then I also get the light bulb moment where like, oh my God, it all makes sense. Can you speak to kind of that impact on self-esteem, I think, for a lot of neurodivergent folk when there's a mismatch between what society is expecting or asking of us and how it's interpreted when we do something different?
Oh, I mean, you said the magic word there, interpretation, right? So one of my favorite exercises to do when I give talks is I'll pick someone in the audience and I'll ask them to stand up. So they stand up and I'm like, great, now sit down. And they sit down. They almost always sit right back in their chair. And I ask them, why'd you sit in your chair? Like, well, you told me to sit down. I'm like, what did I tell you to do? They're, well, you told me to sit. Did I do it wrong? I'm like, it's not even that you did it wrong, because clearly I implied sit in your chair. Why would you sit on the ground? But if you're a neurodivergent person and you're very concrete, sit down means sit directly down. I'm sitting on the ground. And now your teacher or boss or partner is going, what the hell are you doing? Get off the damn ground. You're like, well, you told me to sit down. Not like that. So, our brains tend to be very literal, very concrete. And, even to this day, I will sometimes still ask my wife, I'm like, sarcasm? When she tells me something, I'm like, she's like, yes, honey, you've been doing chores for 2 hours. You can sit down now. And I'm like, okay, that's good. That's good. Because, it comes from a lot of different things, right? But one of those is that mirror neurons, right? So the sort of thing, like the neurological component of empathy and other humans, our neurons fire at a different rate than neurotypical neurons. So we're always kind of offbeat socially or interpersonally because, if neurotypical brains are on 4-4 time, we're on 16/16 time, right? It's still happening and they sync up every once in a while, but there's just a lot more stuff happening, which is why, I'm not everybody's cup of tea as a therapist. But when I collect with somebody, I'm like, I can go as fast as you can. They're like, oh my God, you really can. And then we're just like, you want to go through the entire CBT manual before lunch? Let's do the thing,
Done.
right? So it's this idea that since there's so much misinformation around being neurodivergent, specifically being gifted, a lot of adults try to fix us. They try to turn us into neurotypicals, right? Nobody who's neurodivergent is a failed neurotypical any more than anyone who's introverted is a failed extrovert, right? It's just different systems. And when we honor somebody's system, you're always going to get the best out of that person by meeting them where they are and asking them where they want to go, right? But if you're like, everyone else is marching that way, you must march that way, that assumes a lot of things about that person and immediately puts them on the defensive, right? And defensive people are harder to change.
I mentioned it earlier, and I'd love for you to expand on it. Masking.
Oh boy, yes.
There's so much here. Go.
So it's so interesting. We mentioned before the parallels between the LGBTQ plus community and the neurodivergent community. So you know how some LGBTQ folks can pass, right? Masking is the neurodivergent version of passing. So we're like, okay, here we are. I can look neurotypical if you need me to, right? If I'm in a meeting to get like a big speaking gig or to sell a bunch of books, shirt and tie, I'm making good eye contact. I am using an appropriate voice. I am very serious and sober as a human. And as soon as I leave that office, I'm like, and I need to stim. I need to get that energy out, right? And so this idea that, neurotypicals represent the monoculture, right? There are certain ways of doing things. And those ways are not better or worse, but there's sort of a majority rules aspect to it. Like if you showed up for a job interview in your nicest t-shirt and your best, in your best sweatpants and your most comfortable shoes, because that's what you wear when you're coding and you're going to, farm out, 78 gigs of code for me today. Well, that's awesome. But the rules are that you wear a shirt and tie and a blazer for that. And so you're not going to get that job for simple reasons that we violated an unspoken, unwritten rule. A couple of my neurodivergent kiddos are in college now. And one of them, he's like, he doesn't ask people out on a date to see if they want to hook up with him. He asks people if they want to hook up with him and then asks them out on a date. And he's like, it's just so much more logical. I'm like, it is. As a red-blooded 19-year-old boy, I get that's your end goal here, but there's a certain protocol one must do. He's like, well, what if I found a person who was into that? I was like, then go with God, my child. But, and it's like some girls are a little off-put by that, which I understand, right? But he's also found some people who were very receptive to that forthrightness, if we wanted to call it that, right? So what all this is that there's this inherent tension between authenticity and going along to survive a world that's not built for you. And it's really hard to find that balance and to understand that balance is going to be different in a million different situations every moment of every day. So the technical term for this is context dependent or context independent. Neurotypical people tend to be very context dependent. They adapt their behavior based on what the circumstances are. They're at a football game or at a funeral, at a meeting with their boss. They're behavior will change based on those situations, which is normal and adaptable and makes sense. Neurodivergent people tend to be very context independent. They are who they are, however they are, whenever they are. And, think about like Forrest Gump when he's interviewing with the president. It's like, how about you, son? How do you feel? I need to pay. It's like, there's no social artifice there. It's just, you ask me how I'm feeling. I feel like I need to pee. That's the correct answer. So, the work I do is a lot about, I'm not trying to get you to mask so much as I'm trying to get you to code switch. I want you to be able to have these different protocols to run in these different situations. Because if you can get that job, you're going to be their best damn coder. You're going to get the video game out before Christmas. That's amazing. We need that. And it's not selling yourself out to adapt the skills you need to do to play the game. And, I think about growing up as a kid, and we're about the same age. Yeah, you and I.
I
right?
think so.
I'm 40. I'm almost 42. I was born in 1983. And growing up as, 80s, 90s kids, being smart was not cool.
No,
I've been shoved into many a locker,
I had a carrot hit me in the head.
And I was a chubby kid too. So it was a lot of me to get into the locker. Right. But that's the sort of thing. It's like, now nerdiness is cool. In fact, nerdiness is $1 billion industry now. Like in high school, and you can edit this out if it's too crass for the podcast. At high school, I was much more open about my porn than I was about my comic books. Like, I was like, hey, look at these Playboys I got, guys. All right. But it's like, don't look at my Spider-Man, because then you'll think I'm weird. Like, now the sort of the zeitgeist has changed so much around these things that now that's one less area where a lot of people feel like they have to mask, right? If you're a musical theater kid, or you're a Disney adult, or you're a grown-up who does Legos, there are so many more communities that exist for those people, and many of them are online, but so many more of them in person. Our local library, their menu of meetups is like gifted heaven. It's like, I could do this, or I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. And that's what makes, I think that's what gives a lot more people hope these days, because probably the amount of masking you're going to have to do in your life is always going to be more than zero. Like, I don't know if there's a world where you don't have to mask at all, but the more you find right fit environments, the less you have to mask. The less you have to mask, the more bandwidth you have to actually do the things you have to do.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I've certainly witnessed, is when people who are neurodivergent find their people, that there's this potential blooming where it's like, I can just kind of shed some of this weight that I'm holding in order to force myself to make eye contact. And here, nobody cares. I'm just going to drink my orange juice. We're going to have a conversation. I'm never going to look at you, and it's going to be good. And the change in expectation I've seen has been really beautiful, and I think welcoming. I know one of the things that's important to you is creating more adaptable, affirming spaces for folks who are neurodivergent. Part of the complexity in having this conversation is we're discussing an extraordinary spectrum of people like this. Because there's so much here, as you said, it's like Tourette's, OCD, sometimes anxiety, this cornucopia of potential presentations. But what does more affirming care look like to you? And how can we as clinicians set that tone?
So the most affirming care starts before the session even starts, right? Telehealth has been a godsend to the neurodivergent community. Because how many of my kids will just jump on a video call, like, hey, I forgot we had a session today, but I'm walking across Midtown. Can we talk? I'm like, of course we can. You don't need to be in my office in my overstuffed chair. I don't care. Do you care? I don't. Who cares? But it's we offer, when we're doing the background demographic stuff, it's you can fill out this Google form, you can do voice to text, you can upload something you've sent to somebody else. Like, we just want the information, right? Because, I mean, I don't know how your neurodivergence does with this. I hate forms. I just like, applications to me are just the death. I'm like looking at an application on my screen here that's like, yeah, fill this out to get the insurance thing. Yeah, if I don't fill out this application, I can't get the insurance thing and solve this problem. But I've been working on this application for 2 weeks because my brain's just like, can't. I hate it. I don't want to. So we try and like make that stuff easier. Once you get them to the actual session, right? I think it's vital to really honor a person's goals, right? And it's like, listen, I just want to make enough money to have my own apartment and not have to see anybody and game with my online friends. Cool. Doesn't hurt anybody. Do the thing, right? That's great. So don't you want a family? Don't you want to live in a house in the suburbs? Why? If that's not your journey, like, who does it care? And I guess the other thing I would put in there would be that a lot of times when you're talking about somebody's neurodivergence, you can't always go through the front door. Sometimes you have to go through the side door, right? Like, oh, you are very socially offbeat and strange. Let's fix that. I'm like, well, screw you. I'm not doing that. But it's like, if you can identify somebody's goals and values, it's like, well, okay, so if you'd like to be more successful dating, I might be able to give you some suggestions to move forward in that. Would you be interested in going that direction? Like, it's really about joining with that client, and to me, I tell all my clients at our first meeting, it's like, I know all the psychology stuff, but you're the expert of you. When we meet in the middle, that's how we get the best outcome, right? And I think that's just good practice anyway, but I think it means a lot more to the neurodivergent community.
A total yes on the forms. And I've seen that in my practice as well. And it, as you've already said, the world is not designed for people who are neurodivergent. So we're talking about clients who have dyslexia or dysgraphia, and the assumptions that we're just making of like, hey, fill this out, without any appreciation that they may not be able to. And I will call myself out. I made that mistake very early on dyslexia. And it was very, very early in my career. And it was like, we're going to work on this worksheet. And then it was like, no, we're not. I'm going to read it to you and we're going to talk about it. But it was a real swift reminder to me to slow down and be more mindful for who the client is and what their world is like. If I had done a different assessment or if I had asked questions differently, I probably would have had that answer. And so I never skip over. Our culture as a whole tends to mental unhealth, if you will, as a bad thing. I think we're making progress on that idea to be able to actually talk about mental health and mental wellness. However, it's still very much kind of a deficit model. And coming into therapy, for some people already, just picking up the phone or even thinking about talking to a therapist is like incredibly shame-inducing and scary, particularly for folks who are neurodivergent. How can we further create trust in therapy? Because they've probably already had experiences out in the world of not doing things the way that some person in power wanted them to do them.
Gosh, I love that question. You have a talent as a host to like sum up like several strands into like a really like perfectly targeted question.
It's that giftedness.
Right? I mean, check.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, one of those other super fun unofficial diagnostic criteria of gifted people is how well do you do with compliments? Because, we're all like Golem. We're like, I likes them, but I hates it. Tricksy hobbitses. It's so bad. It's like, please praise me, but also don't. But also don't stop. But also maybe write it down. It's so bad. Of course, I blew the question out of the water. So very few people in my practice have started with me as their therapist. Almost everyone has tried some other therapists. and they haven't felt affirmed. And people sometimes they're like, oh, you're the guy. You've unlocked the code. It's like, I really haven't. Like, I'm probably an above average therapist. I'm pretty good at what I do. Now, this isn't false modesty. There are better therapists than me. But the thing I do best, the thing that I do better than most people is I'm like, listen, I'm going to go super meta with this. I'm saying, what is this going to take for you to be successful? Do you need to meet for shorter times? Do you need to meet atypical hours? Do you just need to do text sessions? Like, and tell me what's worked for you in the past. Tell me what hasn't worked for you in the past. Let me check in with you, because this isn't therapist as God, right? This is, where do you want to go and how can I help you get there? Like, I'm not the sage on the sage. I'm the guide on the side, right? And I think that's something that a lot of our colleagues could stand to be reminded of, because ADHDers don't need us to fix them, right? Dyslexic kids don't need to be taught to read. They need to fall in love with words. If they fall in love with words, the reading and writing will come, right? But like you said, it's that deficit approach reminds you of how broken you are. And, and I really believe you can't shame someone into getting better. You can inspire them, you can motivate them, but if you're always reminding somebody of something they're not, then it's like asking someone not to think about a purple elephant, right? Whatever you do, don't think about a purple elephant. It's like, well, what is it I'm not supposed to think of? It's that purple elephant. Damn, I failed.
I appreciate what you're suggesting and kind of thinking about flexibility in session a different way, and also acknowledging that really is an entirely different approach to therapy than the origins of psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. Where it was like, no, you're going to sit here and you're going to tell me your problems and I'm going to analyze you and tell you what's wrong with you, and maybe how you're going to fix it. Give me some money, goodbye. It has been an interesting thing for me to work with so many neurodivergent clients, and also sometimes see the way that interventions have presented themselves sometimes in really obvious ways. I've had a client who has really struggled with ADHD, tried different interventions, tried different medications, and feeling numb on this one or feeling too wired on that one. And come hell or high water, that person is not going to be on time for session. It's just not going to happen. And that if we look back in different models of psychotherapy, then it's like, wow, that person has a lot of resistance, and we need to unpack their resistance to psychotherapy and what happened in the last session that led to them being late. And then it's also like my realization of a clinician where it's just like, no, your brain just doesn't work that way. Like, because that client's brain does what my brain does, which like, okay, I have 3 minutes, so I can fit in this and this and this and this and this and this. And I'm like, oh shit, it was 11 minutes, not 3. And understanding that that's how that person's brain works. Can you talk about some of the maybe more obscure things that people might not think about? One thing I'm thinking about is like the concept of body doubling, or these things. Because like these are things like if you don't work with a lot of neurodivergent people, you may not have even heard of them. And it's like, no, these are actually really handy things, but they were not taught to us in therapy school, quote unquote.
Yeah. Right. Oh my gosh. I love body doubling so much. And it's funny because like when I was getting started out, my first boss was like, you cannot text your clients. That's a boundary violation. Yes. And I was like, the hell I can't. Do I want to call every person and be like, hi, where are you? Oh, you're near? Great. Like, text, sup. And I have a Google Voice number. It turns on at 8 a.m. in the morning. It turns off at 8 p.m. I tell my clients, can't text me after 8 p.m. I'll get it at 8 a.m. next morning. Given how many college kids I see, that's a good thing. Yeah. I don't want the text at 1:30 in the morning. Dr. Matt! Which is awesome for thinking about me, I guess. But that's the thing. It really is... I want as many tools in their toolbox as they can. So you can get really practical with it. I am often described as being aggressively pragmatic. Like it just has to work. I don't care why it works so much. I just care that it works. And body doubling is a great example of this. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term, it's the idea of the weight of having somebody else with you whether that's in person or connected via the phone or computer, allows you to do more work. Basically, the weight of somebody else activates your prefrontal cortex and says, oh, I can do the thing now. And people are like, I don't understand that. I'm like, okay, just imagine this. Call your mom. You call your mom. You're on the phone with your mom. What do you do while you're on the phone with your mom? And people are like, oh, I clean the house. That's body doubling. That's what it is. And it's like, wait, what? It's like, exactly. Like, you're on the phone with somebody. Like, I'm going to go walk the neighborhood. I'm going to get my walk in today while I'm on the phone with somebody. I tell my college kids all the time, it's like, if you want to make friends, it's not the frat parties, football games, keggers. The friendships are forged under, like, dude, I got to go to CVS. Do you want to come with me? Yes, I desperately need to go to CVS, right? I haven't had a vegetable in 4 months. We should go to a grocery store of some kind. It's those things. I mean, when I became a dad, like my dad friends were forged over late night text sessions, freaking out, rather than like, let us do a play date at the local park. Like, there's an organicness to it that flows into more, I think, more meaningful long-term growth. So body doubling is one. Another one is the double empathy problem. So, you have two people with two different systems trying to be empathetic to each other, and there's just a miss. They're missing fundamental pieces of each person's story. So their attempts at empathy can come across as either patronizing or dismissive, or, as my clients always say, like, they're saying they're sorry for the wrong damn thing.
Yeah, totally.
Right. I'm so sorry you're going through that. I don't care about that. I care about this other thing.
Totally.
Right. And so it's the idea of, if you can understand what the empathy a person is asking for is and feels like, then you can respond to that empathy in a way that is much more successful and attuned to that person's actual needs. And like the version of that my wife and I use are like, when, she's had trouble at work, I'm like, hey, are you in problem solving mode, or do you just want me to listen? She's like, I just want you to listen. Great. Because I'm a problem solver by nature. I mean, I got into this field for a reason, but by using a little meta communication and framing the conversation in that way, both of our anxieties go down, because she's not worried that I'm going to try and fix the problem that she doesn't actually want to be fixed. And I don't have to sit there and think, how do I solve this problem? How do I solve this problem? How do I solve this problem? It frees everybody to be the best version of themselves. And if you can take a minute and ask that brave question, are we on a date? That's another good one. You want to know if you're on a date with someone, right? How am I doing in this job interview, for instance, right? Those are things that they're just ways to open doors to communication that solve the double empathy problem and get everybody on the same page.
I am so glad that you brought up that point. And it's something I've experienced and I've thought about. My love in therapy is feedback-informed treatment, and, the idea of being as responsive as I can. And I have had the double empathy problem with clients, and I have been really glad that I laid the groundwork early on that said, sometimes I'm going to miss and I'm going to get it completely wrong. And my hope is that you will tell me, and that when I ask you about it, that there's enough security in our relationship that you can tell me. And I have had that exact thing happen more than once, where it's like my brain is like, so here's the problem. And then the client's like, no, that's not the problem at all. It was like what happened with the boss, not like my boyfriend. And I'm like, oh, okay. So the boss. And I think that even that flexibility, I think, may be different between working with neurotypical and neurodivergent people, because it's like you're reading a story and then, I guess we're looking at it and trying to tease out, like, what were the most important problems? And that there's like the neurotypical version of the reading of that story, and then there's the neurodivergent reading of that story, that those are two different things. And then there's also like my client's neurodivergent reading of that story, and recognizing like even those are not the same. But I'm glad you bring that up, because it sounds like a lot of it is in the interpretation and also the framing of like, I'm here to try to understand. I want to understand your worldview. And how can I do that clinically in a way to best meet your needs and adapt my style to what you need instead of forcing you to adapt yourself to what I'm saying therapy needs to be.
I mean, once again, it's that pushing back on that therapist is God mindset, right? Like that's, and I love what you said about like, tell me I'm wrong. Like I welcome that feedback. Like, I mean, I always tell my clients, like, I will always be truthful with you. I never lie in the therapy space, which means if I'm telling you something, it might hurt. It might be a punch in the gut, but it's true, right? And I was like, and all I can ask of you is the same. All I can ask of you is to be as honest with me as you can, right? Knowing that there are lots of reasons we may not be fully honest, some of which have to do with trauma and some of that have to do with development, some of which means I have ADHD and I forgot a really important part of the story that actually would have changed how you felt about it, but my bad.
Yeah. You and I really could keep talking on this because there's so much here. This is where my brain is going. One of the conversations that's been happening on social media recently is in response to the TV show Love on the Spectrum. And it's like they go on a date and one person, says, do you want to see me again? And then it's like, no, not really. I think we should be friends. And it's like, what a revelation for people to actually just say what they think and how they feel and to be able to communicate in such an open way without so much consideration and how nice it would be if we could create that in therapy spaces where it's like, you can just tell us how you feel and we're going to be able to hear that and respond to it and also be able to deconstruct some of the nuance, particularly in social interactions where there may be a lot of pressure to not tick, to not stim, to make eye contact. I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with that were like pretty much forced to make eye contact and they're like staring at somebody's eyebrows because like they were told that's what they had to do. And it's like, hey, if you want to do it with me, you could do it with me. But if I don't even know what color your eyes are, it's okay. But I'm glad for the points that you're bringing up because they're really things that I can see could have such a big impact on therapy and on our clients, and for them to have some room and space and flexibility to do what they're actually coming in to do instead of masking and kind of pretending to further operate in a world that doesn't serve them or isn't flexible to their needs.
That means a lot. Thank you.
So for our listeners who want to learn more about just working with neurodivergent clients in general, what are some of your best recommendations?
So, we all benefit mostly from systems, right? So there are sort of two primary national organizations that serve neurodivergent kids. So the first in the gifted space is the National Association for Gifted Children, NAGC. They're the national organization, and most states have a state gifted organization. Some are more robust than others, right? Here in New Jersey, we have a really strong one. So that's a great organization. If your kid is more neurospicy, kind of all over the place, they don't really know like where to go with this kid, the Council for Exceptional Children, CEC, is another really good one. They have some gifted services. They have a lot of twice exceptional services. They have, dyslexia and nonverbal communication strands. They have a tremendous breadth of options. So I often tell parents to start at their state level for NAGC and CEC. Those are usually great places to go.
Fantastic. And for folks who are listening who want to learn more about you and about your work, what's the best way to do that?
So I have two primary online identities because I have two primary jobs. So I say that if you want me for you, our therapy practice is the Neurodiversity Collective and the neurodiversitycollective.com. So that's where we do our therapy model, coaching, IQ testing, stuff like that. If you want me for your organization, say your school has a lot of kids that we describe what we just talked about today, and it would make sense for me to come in and do a professional development for you, well, that would be drmatzakreski.com. Those are sort of the two best places to find us.
I have so much more that I want to ask you about. I don't have time to do it. For our listeners, again, this has been Dr. Matt Zakreski joining us today talking about neurodivergence. I really appreciate it. You gave me a lot to think about and just a lot of solidarity. So thank you for that. It has been a pleasure to have you. And yeah, I appreciate you coming on and sharing these things, because if 20% of us are neurodivergent, we should probably be talking about this a little.
It's an everybody thing. And I'll tell you, not to be totally presumptuous, but if we want to do a part 2, we could totally do a part 2.
I'm totally down for a part 2.
Okay.
So yes, absolutely. I don't know what it's going to be, but let's do a part 2. I'm totally there for it. Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matt. I really appreciate it.
A real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.